in the Environment and Society Programme at Chatham House. Welcome to this UNFCCC side event, Averting Planetary Peril, convening scientists, policymakers to tackle systemic climate risks. This event is being run in conjunction with Climate Central and the International Science Council. One of our central challenges of climate action is enabling those with power to influence climate policy to engage with complex climate science and evidence when this forms only one of many competing demands on their time. We've come a long way in climate change being accepted as posing significant risks to society, but the complexity of climate change means we are still some way from decision makers being in receipt of the information that illustrates the full extent of their potential future climate impacts. This event will explore examples of work to engage different types of stakeholders with evidence on climate change and will generate best practice examples and lessons learnt. We have a brilliant lineup of speakers. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your questions and debating them. So please do get ready to ask those questions, particularly on the virtual platform where you can post your questions. We'll hear from our first two speakers on my right, have an interim 12-minute Q&A, and then hear from our final three speakers and finish with a 20-minute Q&A. Our first speaker is Dr. Benjamin Strauss, who is CEO and Chief Scientist at Climate Central. Thanks for being with us, Ben. The images from Climate Central displayed on the video at the beginning of the event regarding sea level rise are both captivating and horrifying. Can you tell us how Climate Central's interactive coastal risk maps and photorealistic images of long-term sea level rise are used to engage policymakers regarding climate change risks?
Well, thanks so much for having me, for having us. And I'd like to begin with a story. So the image that you're looking at, the artist Olafur Eliasson, before the Paris COP, took a ship out to Greenland, lassoed a dozen icebergs that had just calved from the ice sheet, tugged them over to Copenhagen, loaded each one on a separate truck, trucked them to Paris, and arranged them in the 12 points of a clock. And he called this piece of art Ice Watch. And you could go throughout the talks to this location outside the Pantheon and watch them slowly melt. And I stumbled across it, and it had a really profound message for me, which is that even when it's warm enough for ice to melt, big ice melts slowly. Very simple, very important in its ramifications, because we've already turned up the world's thermostat by more than 1 degree Celsius, but Greenland and Antarctica and the glaciers have hardly even begun to catch up with that amount of warming. So the images that you just saw, and a few more images that I'm about to show for those who arrived late or those just joining online, illustrate this idea of long-term sea level rise that we're committed to, that we lock into depending on the future path that we take with warming. Right? So the first image I'm going to show is, what if we keep on our current path and head to 3 degrees Celsius warming? And that is our current path when you look out beyond 2100. Or what happens if we limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And the images show the sea level you get in either of those scenarios after multiple centuries, but we assure that in the near term, depending on, just in the next couple of decades, depending on how much more carbon we put in the atmosphere. So I'm just going to go through them really rapidly. That's right here, 3 degrees, 1.5. We'd still be wet here in the Armadillo with 1.5. Little south in London, Buckingham Palace, 3, 1.5. World's tallest building. The building being built to get taller, toes in the water unless we cut emissions. Bangladesh, Russia, downtown Cape Town, and close to home for me, Washington, D.C. So these places include nations that are high on climate ambition. They include nations that are resistant to climate ambition. We all share the same ocean coming up at our coasts. I feel like this kind of imagery that we use to try and communicate that importance to policymakers, right, has a few important take-home lessons. One, we're very visual, and communicating in pictures when you can tends to be much more powerful than numbers and abstractions. Two, making it local is really critical when you have these conversations. What does it mean for my place or the places that I care about? And three, we have an enormous choice of legacy. We are talking about sea levels that will unfold over many hundreds of years. But it's our choice whether to set that in motion or not, how much to set in motion. So we have an enormous choice of the legacy that we could leave, and whether that legacy is really a necklace of sunken ruins around the coasts of the world, or whether it's a global coast that looks more like the one we have today. How will we be remembered, right? The people at this COP, the generations alive today. So there's another form of visual communication we use a lot that we also think is powerful, and that's maps. And I'm going to come into the nearer term, closer to practical policy-making near-term considerations when it comes to resilience. So here's a map of Mumbai in India, showing land projected to be below a typical worst-of-the-year flood by mid-century in red. You can see a pretty significant effect in the region. But actually, this map uses elevation data that are 1.5 to 3 meters too low. It turns out that all of the leading academics in coastal risk, the World Bank and others, for years, in fact, mostly up until the present, have been using elevation data that is biased 1.5 to 3 meters too high. In other words, when you think of sea level this century, forecast to 1 meter, it's really underestimating the threat. The reason is that the global data comes from satellite sensing that can't tell the difference between a rooftop or a treetop or the ground, and those things get averaged together, and developed areas look like mounds or hills. So a colleague and I, a number of years ago, got together and said, can we use AI to improve this? And we were able to eliminate almost all of that error. And the next map I'm going to show you shows the risk when you get rid of that issue for Mumbai, where very much reduced the error, substantially more land at risk. And this really applies worldwide in these maps. That's the old look. Here's the new look. We just released a new version just a month ago, and it's freely available to all. All the images that I've shown you and these maps can be accessed via picturingourfuture.org, by the way. Finally, I want to return to the long-term perspective and show a map with a long-term commitment. And you're going to see in blue, from the same location, areas committed to be below future sea level based on the warming we have already experienced, 1.1 degrees. And then in red on the margin, commitments based on 1.5. So kind of our best case scenario that we're trying to keep alive. So watch for the change. So what's already committed is about the same, a little bit worse than that mid-century flood. And then 1.5 adds the red areas that you can see on the map. So the final key takeaway after visual, local, and our legacy choice that I have is when we talk about policy on the resilience side, how are we going to plan our coastal places for these inevitably rising seas? Anything we do today won't be in vain. Those sea levels are coming, and we have to think about it as the first step on a journey, right? We can't get fooled by any particular sea level projection, and that's what we have to solve for. It's just the first step on a journey.
Ben, thank you. That's fascinating, scary, but a degree of hope in there too.
Yeah.
We'll turn now to Professor Tim Benton, Research Director, Emerging Risks, and Director of the Environment and Society Programme at Chatham House with myself. Tim, Chatham House is working on several projects which bring together scientists and policymakers. What can you tell us about this work and the lessons learned as an intermediary organisation working with both groups?
Thanks, Dan. I personally have worked on impact assessments for climate change for over a decade now, including US-UK task force of 2015, which was looking at global food system resilience to extreme weather. I've done 2 rounds of the UK's climate change risk assessment, and our Chatham House work that Dan has mentioned. There are 2 reports that are available at the back. Please look at them and take them away. Have done a overall climate change risk assessment and a report on hazards that should worry us most. And we also work on a range of other projects that are associated with climate risks, including the Cascades project, which is on transboundary risks. So what have I learned in all of this time? So 3 major messages. Risks are very poorly understood. Now, the traditional way of framing risk is that it's a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And the normal way that we've thought about it is the hazard might be rainfall. Your exposure is, do you live at the top of the hill or the bottom of the hill, and might you get flooded? And your vulnerability is whether or not you've got kind of flood defenses. And we're getting much better at defining the hazards in terms of we're getting better at understanding the tail risks associated with extreme weather. There are many things that we're still not good at, such as tipping point risks or some of the ways that changing position of the jet stream might influence extreme weather. And there are some risks that we absolutely have no potential yet of understanding, including the ecological risks from disrupting ecologies and the way that they may lead to emerging new diseases like COVID perhaps, or pests and disease outbreaks in general. So although our traditional way of thinking about hazards is relatively straightforward, and we think about flood risks, and we think about heat waves, and we think about droughts, the range of risks that we're good at understanding is still relatively small. But in the traditional direct risk sense, exposure and vulnerability are easy. Will you get flooded? Will you get exposed? Can you build your defenses to that? But perhaps the biggest threat to us all in our societies is not the hazards that hit us now in our place, but the hazards that might impact somewhere overseas, and those hazards create risks that cascade across boundaries, across sectors, and so on, because we are all, every single society, is globally embedded in very complex networks that can be disrupted. And when you think about the way that something happening overseas might impact supply chains, those exposure and vulnerability issues are to do much more with, are the goods that you might import, or are your borders secure in the case of people movement or supply chain disruptions? Do you have just-in-time supply chains that increase your exposure to risks? So if something happens to them, everything falls down, and so on. And these, the exposures and vulnerabilities in these complex risks, are deeply, deeply uncertain, and they're socio-economic, cultural, governance issues, and therefore radically uncertain when you look ahead. What will happen to trade? What will happen to the governance of trade? What will happen to the geopolitics and great power politics in the future, and how will they determine our risks? And we're used to thinking about black swan events in terms of saying, well, where are the high impact, low probability risks? But if you think about these cascading risks, I'm an expert in food systems, I can think of literally thousands of ways that we can get a global food crisis from droughts or floods or diseases or impacts on supply chains or port infrastructure or, whatever. If we focus only on black swan events, but there are 1,000 ways that a low likelihood event could impact on our food system, then actually what you have in any arbitrary time period is quite a high risk of something happening rather than a low risk, our traditional way of thinking about black swans. And actually that puts the focus on us building resilience rather than trying to pinpoint and quantify a particular hazard and how it might cascade through our systems. So that's message number one. Message number two is that people are unwilling to act given the sorts of uncertainties I'm talking about. Theoretical approaches means that we are kind of hardwired to be more likely to act if we know when something will happen rather than the magnitude of the event. So if the timing of something happening is 20, 30, 40 years or sometimes a century ahead, there is very little impetus for us psychologically to act on those risks. Whereas if we knew something was going to happen in 2031, we are much more attuned psychologically to deal with that. Quantification of risks acts as a spur to action, but many of the risks that are really going to be impactful are unquantifiable at the moment. The sorts of cascading risks I'm talking about, or ecological risks, pandemic risks, and so on. What are easy to quantify are the, in a sense, conservative risks. The way that the global climate might change, we're very good. We can understand what will give us a 1.5 degrees. We can't yet understand what the weather will be like in a 1.5 degree world because we aren't yet capable of predicting the tipping points or predicting the way that the jet stream will respond. So our risks that we can quantify tend to be the smaller risks. And those are frightening enough, but we have to get real about the reality of the magnitude of risks. My third point is that a well-told story can be much more actionable than a complex quantitative analysis. Decision makers, as Ben has alluded to, respond to key things relevant to them and their context, whether it's geography or their policy domain or their sector. And so granular discussions are often more useful than generic approaches saying sea level rise is going to be important or drought risk is going to increase. And specific historical examples are becoming much more common and common enough that we can now point to examples of where things have happened and build the story about, well, imagine this being 10 times worse or 15 times worse or happening every year instead of every decade. In a similar vein, there is a capacity issue. Climate change is often seen as a domain in itself. It belongs in that particular silo, in that particular ministry. And what actually we need to do is build capacity to understand the way that climate change will impact on our particular areas of interest. And that means mainstreaming climate change into decision-making in all aspects of our society and our economies. One of my colleagues who works on global macroeconomics said to me the other day, climate change is starting to move to the point where it is accepted as part of the economy rather than separated from the economy. And that's what we need. And an important approach, I think, is to use narrative scenarios for stress testing, develop particularly for compounding and cascading risks, a plausible set of circumstances that you can say to a decision maker, given that this might happen, what would be your institutional response to this set of risks? It is important also to recognize that the perception of risks is often as important as the risks themselves. Complex and cascading risks rarely are the only reason for systemic failure, but are often the spark that breaks the camel's back. Just as an example, if you think about what happened in the food price spike of 2010, it's created the conditions for the Arab Spring and the geopolitical reconfiguration of the Middle East. But that was because the food price rises caused by climate were on top of already destabilizing economies with failing governance. Understanding systemic fragility better opens minds to recognizing the reality of risks and the way that they can impact. So in summary, we cannot quantify our way into proper risk management, and that's something that's often frightening to scientists, because we will always be behind the curve, and radical uncertainty means we cannot hope to predict all the ways that climate will create hazards and the way they impact. But we can talk our way into proper risk management and build capacity to understand the radical inherent uncertainty. And stories and context-specific examples are really powerful, as Ben's pictures are, in engaging with decision makers. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Tim. Again, some incredibly fascinating insights. We'd like to now turn to the audience. If you have a question, please do raise your hand. Yes, the lady at the front. If you wouldn't mind either moving to the microphone here or here, whichever is most convenient to you. If anyone else does have a question, please do put up your hand now, just so I can kind of cue it up in my mind. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And anyone not on the virtual platform, please do post your questions and I'll try and get to you. Please, if you could just say your name and your affiliation as well, if that's possible.
Susan Rofe, Heriot-Watt University. In 2004, second edition 2009, I wrote a book with David Crichton on adapting buildings and cities for climate change. And we clearly mapped out that there were certain building types, the very high, tall glass towers, that in 1990, if you look at Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai, there wasn't a single building like that on it. There were 3 buildings on Sheikh Zayed. In 30 years, we've gone to this great big forest of tall glass towers. And these are the most toxic and polluting structures on the planet. And when people talk about 40% of energy is used in buildings for, say, electricity, for heating, cooling, and air conditioning buildings, it's only used by 2% of the buildings on the planet. So those 2% are polluting the climate and driving discomfort, extreme weather events for the 98% of the people on the planet. So I gave a paper on comfort justice. You know, why does the world allow this? We knew this was happening, we predicted it, we said it again and again, and nothing is done about it. These climate toxic structures are still allowed, just like the great big SUVs are. So it's not a matter of not knowing, it's a matter of not doing anything about it.
Thank you very much. I will direct that question first to Ben. Maybe my prerogative as chair, I'll just add on to it, that maybe there needs to be a degree to which the risks and potential impacts of climate change are also related to consumption. Would you say that's fair, and the consumption of energy and that interrelated nature? Okay. Ben, would you like to?
Well, I think, you know, an important point actually comes from what Professor Lenton just said earlier, which is we need to be integrating climate thinking into everything. And I think that there's an easy tendency for everyone to be involved in their particular project and not put it in that context. So, yeah, look, I think this isn't where you might think this goes, but in the Bible, there's the story of Noah's flood, which actually probably connects to an actual sea level rise that happened historically out of a natural climate warming. But the next story is the Tower of Babel. And I think the Tower of Babel is the first climate crime, or you can read it that way. People built a tower that was too high. It was impinging on the zone, on the kind of divine sky, right? God had just sent a rainbow to Noah, which said, I will not destroy the world again with the flood. I will not destroy There's a loophole there, right? We could still destroy the world with a flood. And what's the next thing we do? We build a tower into the sky. And we're punished for that, too. And I think we would actually do well to tie back to some of that old wisdom as we build these increasingly, you know, wasteful and polluting structures high into the sky. It's messing with the sky is the wrong thing to do, directly or metaphorically.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. I'll come to you in a second. Yes, please, sir, if you'd like to step forward to the microphone.
Larry Moffat. I'm with the Press Club Brussels Europe and also with the citizen movement Rise for Climate Belgium. The photographs you showed of Washington and London underwater, I would think would certainly inspire policymakers, politicians to invest billions in building seawalls and dams, whatever is needed to keep the water out. But that would then mean less funds available for mitigation, for reducing emissions, less funds available to help Bangladesh and Pacific Islands to protect themselves from sea rise. So my broader question is how to find the right balance between adaptation and mitigation. What would be your advice to policymakers?
Thanks very much. And I'll just say that we'll open the questions to the speakers on my left as we come to the end of the session. But Tim, would you like to take that on?
I'll pass to Ben because he'll say something specific about sea level rise, no doubt. But I think there is a clear need to both mitigate and adapt. There are some of these risks that we cannot adapt out of because they will be so existential. So we can't just do adaptation, and we can't do just mitigation because we absolutely need to adapt, as Ben so eloquently said. You know, sea level rise is coming, whatever we do. But I think there is a kind of area to pick up on Dan's earlier comment around how do we think about the demand side, and some actions can both be adaptive and mitigative, so that we're investing not in that versus that, but we're investing in something that can do both. And in my area, it's notably absent of food systems. It's notably absent in the diplomatic area, that no one is talking about food and getting diets right for people's health, reducing food demand, changing the footprint of land, allowing more land to be farmed in a more resilient way, and creating that safe space which is both adaptive and also it will reduce carbon footprints. And so I think there is something that as we go through this journey, we haven't got enough money to mitigate just only through technology and adapt to everything. We also have to start thinking about the demand side, which can be both at the same time.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, please, Ben.
I'll just say briefly, in terms of the specifics of those projections, we're talking about sea level rise unfolding over hundreds of years, so there's not much of a conflict. There needs to be a lot of investment and mitigation right now to prevent those scenarios. I'll also say that I think on the mitigation side, really a lot of it is more investment than cost. It's a decision to do something, but there will be financial returns to the investment for a great deal of that cost. And finally, I think my hope is that leaders in many areas will be energized to mitigate more as they start to confront the high cost of adaptation. When they see the problem is coming home to roost and they have to spend, suddenly the perspective flips. Wait a minute, this is unfair, this is a burden to us. The world, everyone together, had better start bringing down the problem because I don't want to bear the cost of adaptation. So we all need to mitigate. I think they can work together. Unfortunately, we're in the position we have to do both. There's no other way.
Thanks very much. Would you like to answer? Oh, okay. We've probably got time for just this one question, so we'll come to yours at the end if that's okay.
Okay, hi, thank you. It's Tom Lewis-Renier from RAP, which is a UK-based NGO. My question is about food systems and the resilience of those, and it's really what's the confidence of the panel in the causality between reducing food waste in particular and the reductions in greenhouse gases, particularly in terms of the flexibility and agility of the sort of food system to adapt to the reduction in consumption. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That feels like very clearly one for Tim.
I guess it's how you reduce food waste. I mean, part of the challenge, and I'll tell you an anecdote about my past history. I once addressed G20 around issues to do with food waste, and I said to the ministers there and the chief scientists there, if you could wave a magic wand and get rid of the 30% of food that's wasted, would you tell your farmers to produce less food? And the answer was no, we would use it for something else. So it depends on what the something else is and whether or not it's a silver bullet. My own personal feeling is that food waste is a side effect of a deeply dysfunctional system, that for many people food is so cheap it's economically rational to waste, and it's partly so cheap because it externalizes the environmental impacts. And the only way to transform the food system is to get that into the kind of right place, and that in itself, if we valued food in the way that it impacts on our health and environment, if we internalize the externalities, food would have a different value to us and would perhaps be less willing to waste it, and then we wouldn't have the same problems that we currently have. I don't think just by saying we'll deal with waste in this way, it will solve any of the problems that are really deep-seated to the food system.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much. We'll now move on. So we're going to turn to Regina Rodriguez, who is Professor of Physical Oceanography at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. Regina, your project, My Climate Risk, seeks to make climate information meaningful at the local scale. Can you tell us a little about the project, how you achieved this goal of localizing climate threats, and why that's so important?
Okay, so My Climate Risk is a new activity of the World Climate Research Program within the World Meteorological Organization, and aims to develop a bottom-up approach to regional climate risk, which starts from the local decision context and enables relevant climate information to be brought into that context. This perspective completely inverts the construction of climate information from the traditional scientific paradigm and focus on dealing with local reality, the importance of simplicity and local empowerment. So we know that to reduce risks and increase resilience, we needed a good adaptation plan. For instance, the energy provider of my state in southern Brazil needs accurate projection of rainfall, since most of energy comes from hydroelectric. However, the confidence in long-term projections of rainfall for southern Brazil is very low. Some models projecting an increase, while some decrease or no change in rainfall. Unless we can give some degree of certainty, decision makers will generally resort to the do-nothing option. If we involve the stakeholders from the beginning, we will learn that for this particular case, the problem is a drier climate for the hydroelectrics, right? So we can use only those models' outputs that project a decrease in rainfall, minimizing the uncertainty. For the case of urban planning of a hilly city, we can use projections of increasing rainfall, because in this case, it would be a landslide problem with above average rainfall. So climate information has to be tailored for local needs. Within this co-production process, the idea is also to enable the local community to be self-sufficient. That is a local empowerment. And finally, these techniques must be simple. We know that communities from the global south are and will be the most affected. They don't have the resource to develop their own expensive and complex tools, so simple techniques are a must. Much of climate change science is necessarily big science, but in order to make climate information usable for adaptation, it's also necessary to discover the beauty of smallness. We need climate change science for adaptation that takes a bottom-up approach and consider the reality, but with simplicity and empowerment of local community. And here I paraphrase E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. Science produced the climate information, but climate information is nothing by itself. It's a me without an end, a mere potentiality, unfinishing sentence. Can this new paradigm help us to finish the sentence, to turn the potentiality into reality to the benefit of all? That's what I want just to say about My Climate Risk.
Thank you, Regina. I think the commonality between both what you and Ben have both said is bottom-up, local, make it relevant, make it engaging. Otherwise, decision makers, policy makers don't perhaps engage as much as they should or could do. We're now going to turn to our virtual speaker, who I'm hoping is going to appear from somewhere behind me, Professor Jana Sillmann, who is from the University of Hamburg and the Centre for International Climate Research in Norway. Jana, the Knowledge Action Network on Emergent Risks and Extreme Events, are working with the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction and the International Science Council on a briefing note on systemic risk. Can you tell us about that briefing note? Who's it for? And how do you hope it will enable engagement on systemic risks? Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And basically following up on the previous speaker that highlighted the bottom-up approach, this briefing note is connecting the top-down, basically the big research organizations that currently are engaged in climate change, in risk, and how we can engage these research organizations in producing science that is useful for decision makers that have to deal with systemic risk. And for that, I want to just show a few slides in this presentation. And next slide, please. And give you a little bit of an insight in where this briefing note is going. Here you see in the recent years, several important reports have been published that are also outlined in the briefing note on showing how complex or interconnected our today's risks are. And for instance, here from the World Economic Forum has already since 2016, and here this is from 2019, shown that climate change is one of the top risks perceived by governments, NGOs, industry. And also it is deeply interconnected with other risks, like for instance, diseases and economic risk, failure of crop, for instance. Next slide. So what we also have to know is, next slide, please, that, oh, I don't see that, that 90% from our what the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction report in 2015 has shown in its 20-year review is that 90% of all disasters are weather-related. And in a lot of regions where those are most prominent, those are the most vulnerable regions. And but we also see from our science perspective that there is the most difficult to collect data. And especially now we made many progress with collecting more weather and climate data for analyzing extremes and attributing those to human-induced climate change. We still lack information about the impacts, like how are weather-related extremes connected, for instance, to heat-related mortality in Africa or other countries. Next slide. What we also have to be aware of is that weather-related hazards, they are not just single things like a flood or heat. These are interconnected. Next slide, please. These are interconnected with the societal, like with different, of course, climate drivers. There's not only a storm, it's not only wind, there's also humidity, it's circulation. A heat wave is often also temperature and humidity. But what makes a disaster are also the interconnection with the societal drivers, like how we construct our cities, how we manage our forests, how we manage our for instance, water, and how we design our systems for agriculture and industrial activities. And this kind of interconnectivity, as was already said before, next slide please, was illustrated in one example from the Russian heat wave in 2010, where a mega heat wave and drought basically was cascading through our societal systems, leading also to increases in wheat prices. So that has been, this example has been given by the previous speaker already. So this is one of the prominent examples. And given this complexity, also, next slide, please. This has been taken up by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just released the first report on the physical basis of climate change in August. And there we work closely together with Working Group 2 and 3 to further develop the risk framing from not only the hazard perspective to where the exposure and vulnerability, as was outlined before, but also to include the responses, our responses as society to adapt and mitigate to climate change that again cause new risks because of our systems. Next slide, please. Yes, and this has been shown. I mean, systemic risk is what are the systems we're talking about? They can be sectoral connected via different sectors that interact, which is not only the, for instance, health, food, energies, water sectors that can be affected by one single or compounding extreme events, also through temporal connectivities, and a single event or multiple events can have a diverse impact. And spatially, if heat waves occur around the world, we can have multiple breadbasket failures. And we can also have multiple response options that can amplify or dampen the risk of, for instance, a climate extremes happening. And this, now please go to the last slide. This is basically alarms us or shows us that we need to embrace complexity. The new normal is complexity and also uncertainty. That means we can, what previous speaker already said, we cannot measure everything. Of course, we have lots to do still to measure and understand better systemic risk, and also in order to model and, for instance, forecast certain risks. But we also have to embrace the fact that we are not able to model and measure everything. In the briefing note, we highlight just click once more, because the RISC-CON is, one more time, the RISC-CON has put together this briefing note, which is coming out very shortly, where we explain the data needs and the information needs to better understand and govern climate systemic risk. We also give context to how we can govern this in the future. And for that, the governance has to include a system approach. We have to acknowledge system thinking, and that we need to work transdisciplinary. We have data, we have quantitative models, but we have also qualitative, value-based knowledge that needs to be incorporated in the decision making. And the access to knowledge is important, and an active learning process, including all stakeholders that are involved in the system. And the systems, they are complex, as I said, and the briefing note gives an interesting general introduction about what is a system, how we can, how it can be seen. And we hope that with this briefing note, we can engage with the bigger scientific communities that want to engage and want to provide more information. And as previous speaker said, including climate change in every aspect is important, but also embedding climate information in decision contexts is important. And for that, we also need to engage the science. Because if we want to transform our systems to sustainability and resilience towards systemic risk, we need to consider all spheres, the practical, quantitative, the political, as well as the personal sphere. And this is something we all need to better learn in order to tackle systemic risk. Thank you very much.
Jana, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I think a lot of what you're saying really echoes with Tim's points in particular. It would be really interesting in the Q&A if we can pick up a little bit on how you then present that risk, those systemic risks, back to decision makers, because it's just so difficult. We've been grappling with it somewhat at Chatham House as to how you present that complexity in a way that's digestible, but maybe we'll come back to that in the Q&A. We'll now turn to Loretta Hibber-Girardet, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, who is Chief of Risk Knowledge, Monitoring and Capacity Development at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Loretta, why is it important to better integrate disaster risk reduction within climate change risks? And what is UNDRR doing in this regard?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think it's fairly obvious, the response. I have a 21-year-old son and a 27-year-old daughter. In the time since they were born, the number of climate-related disasters have doubled. And by the time their children reach that age, who knows what the number of climate-related disasters will be. It's happening on a much more frequent basis, climate-related disasters. The disasters are much more intense, but they're also much more unpredictable. And when we work in countries like the Maldives, they say, yes, we were expecting a typhoon, but we weren't expecting it here, and we were not expecting it at this time. So where these events are occurring and when they are occurring is shifting very quickly. So it becomes extremely difficult for countries to be able to better prepare for and manage climate-related disaster risks. And it's not only the risks that are associated with climate. The other risks that countries face interact with climate change, and they compound the vulnerability. So if we look, for example, at COVID-19, which has led so many more millions of people into poverty, well, this obviously reduces their ability to withstand the impacts of climate change. So it's these interconnected nature of risks and how they compound the vulnerability of populations. And so we really do see a need for a much greater integration of climate change action and disaster risk reduction. And unfortunately, due to a number of different factors, disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation have been separated, if you will. And if we look at a country level, most of the countries have climate change managed in a different institutional setup than disaster risk management. And I can remember a few years ago when I was regional chief of UNDRR in Asia Pacific, asking our focal points on DRR, how many of them interact with their climate change counterparts, and there was maybe one or two, and they were largely from the Pacific. For the majority of other countries, there was an absolute disconnect there. But of course, we do have parallel global agreements that we are trying to implement, the Sendai Framework and the Paris Agreement, and they have been developed in separate ways, and the implementation has not come together as much as we would hope for. And of course, the schools of thought are also different. Short-term versus long-term impacts, climate versus non-climate related hazards. And another issue which I think is relevant, of course, for this panel is that the practitioners, the academic communities, and the scientific communities have not always come together in the manner that I think would be required. But I do think that that's changing, and we are really seeing a shift, an understanding that if we are to get on top of and if we are to reduce climate-related risks, we really need a greater merging of climate change and disaster risk reduction. And we are seeing good results, so it's not all negative news. Early warning and preparedness is reducing the number of people who lose their lives due to climate-related disasters. But the extensive risk, these high-frequency, low-intensity disaster events at the local level, which are cumulative in nature, are really having a significant economic impact. And the challenge there, of course, is, and I think one of the speakers mentioned it, it's very difficult for us to measure that impact. We don't actually have the metrics to see what is this impact of high-frequency, low-intensity disaster impacts that we believe are really eroding development gains at a local level. So we really also think that there's, and I think another speaker mentioned this today, there's a lot of emphasis, obviously, on hazards and climate-related hazards and how they are changing. But the issues of vulnerability and exposure, which are really core to disaster risk reduction, we feel really need to be better brought to the forefront of the climate discussion. Because obviously, without exposure and vulnerability, the impacts of climate-related hazard would not be the same. So a lot of areas of convergence which need to happen. And we've just heard about this very complex work around systemic risk. And I think one of the challenges we see is that we know that risk is complex. We know that it's systemic. We know that it's interconnected. It is cascading. But what does a policymaker in a developing country, in a resource-constrained city, do with that information? How do they translate that into the types of policies and tools that they need to make better decisions on urban planning, on development planning, on humanitarian preparedness? There's a big gap, I think, between the science behind risk, which is evolving and which is becoming more complex, and the frontline policymakers who need to start working differently if they are to better manage that risk. So I think that one of the things that UNDRR is trying to do is to help bridge this gap. It's enormously complex because in many of the countries, especially in the least developed countries and the SIDS, the capacities are quite limited, of course. The resources are quite limited. And often they don't even have the most basic data sets available to enable them to put in place evidence-based policies, I would say. So maybe just say a few words about what we're trying to do. We are launching work on comprehensive disaster and climate risk management. And that is very much with an aim to ensuring that all national and local disaster risk reduction strategies really take into account climate change and use climate projections and make available climate data to inform those strategies. Now that may sound pretty simple, but many of the strategies that have been developed in the past few years have not really fully taken into account what the climate future is for that country. It has relied on historical data, which is important, but you need the historical data and the future projections in order to put the country on the right trajectory. We're also launching the Global Risk Assessment Framework, which is an aggregation of all risk information at a country level into a national risk information portal and supporting in the analysis of this information, not just the hazard, the vulnerability, as well as the exposure, as well as data that's required around disaster displacement, for example, poverty, demographic data. And this is quite basic, but it's a starting point that would enable countries, especially LDCs and SIDS, to have at least this basic information to ensure that their planning is more risk-informed and climate sensitive. And we're also working on a program called Making Cities Resilient, which aims to ensure that cities have better access to technical support, to data, and to also support from the private sector to build but also implement resilience strategies. And we have a science community that we work with. And here our aim is really to ensure that the science is being produced is the science that's being used to inform policymaking, to inform programming. And finally, my final point is that we are launching with the World Meteorological Organization, but also with other partners, a new center of excellence on climate and disaster resilience. And here the aim is to really bring the capacities of different UN organizations, but other partners as well, to the fight to reduce climate-related risks. So bringing our work, as you've heard about from our colleagues from RISCAN on systemic risk and risk management, alongside the work of the WMO on forecasting, alongside other agencies as well, that are also contributing to this work on climate change. And here we really hope to work across these silos, bridging the modeling and the social science worlds so that we can have a greater impact together. We have much to learn from each other, but we have to make it accessible to the countries who need it most. And so this is part of what the Center of Excellence will do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loretta. That was really fascinating. We're now going to open up the floor to questions. Have around just over 15 minutes for questions. Be nice to see hands go up just so that I can log it in my, one second, sir, just so I can log it in my head. I'd really like to hear some questions around how do we communicate this complexity, the scale of the challenge, the uncertainty to decision makers. How do we get that lodged into policy? How do we forge ahead? I think the lady at the front was a legacy question from the previous session, so please, yeah, if you can take the mic.
Juliette Rooney-Varga from the University of Massachusetts, Climate Change Initiative. I appreciated your several of you bringing up resilience and the need to sort of bridge adaptation, mitigation, and other non-climate related issues. And I'm just curious, like, how much you've found success in communicating with policymakers about, you know, things that are top of mind for them, but not necessarily climate related. In, you know, so bringing that into your analysis and research as well, but that would build resilience to shocks that include climate, direct climate hazards, but also the knock-on effects, the second-order effects that may play out with societal responses or impacts to climate risks.
Thank you very much. I think I'll go to Jana first, please, if we can bring her up on the screen, because I think that would be most relevant to her presentation. And then we'll maybe go to Loretta, if that's all right. Yeah.
Just wanted to note, too, that
Yes.
Jana, that
hello. Do you hear me?
Just 1 second, Jana. There's an additional adjunct to the question.
Sorry.
Just 1 second. That's
Just
all right.
one quick note, too, that we have used group model building as a systems thinking approach to engage policymakers, where they're actually the ones who are building models along with you. And I'm just curious, too, if you've used that approach and found it to be successful, because we certainly have found it to help in communicating complexity and engage people, engage stakeholders in decision making.
Great. Jana, and then we'll go to Loretta. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. And yes, indeed, since we're seeing this need for integrating better climate information with societal information to build resilience, the RISCON is basically connecting, or a network that is bridging and connecting different scientific communities: the World Climate Research Program, the Integrated Disaster Risk Program, and Future Earth, which is on sustainability science. And there we try to bring together scientists that work on these different aspects of climate change and societal resilience, but also we engage with stakeholders. And as you say, and as also Regina, who is on in the WCRP Lighthouse activity on my climate risk, we really need to connect this science with the local level, with the stakeholders. And for that, we have a really good example in Norway, which they call Climaton or Hackathon, where they bring together climate scientists with local decision makers, like, for instance, city managers or city governors, city planners, water managers, and different people that are affected by, for instance, a certain climate extremes, or they have to make an adaptation plan, and they sit together and discuss their different perspectives, their different needs from their decision standpoint. So I think bringing the different people together and learning from each other and seeing how the relationships play out in the systems, that can help us to connect the science and the decision makers, the governance, and help to have sustainable decisions and developments to reduce systemic risk.
Thank you, Jana. Loretta, do you want to add briefly to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think when science is too abstract, people cannot relate to it, and that includes climate science. So some of the interesting work that I've seen going on is when you go to a community and you talk to the community about what they value, and bringing that values perspective to it, and then showing and relating how climate change could impact and change those things that they value most, and really getting them to react to that. And I think there was some interesting work going on in Australia and the Pacific, like around this type of approach. So storytelling and listening to how people have dealt with issues over the years, many years, in this indigenous knowledge is often very much values-based. And so trying to relate it, I think, to these very complex issues is showing to have some success. So I think that we need to learn more from those types of experiences.
Thank you. We'll go to the gentleman at the front in the blue tie. I think you were stood up just before, and then we'll come to you, if that's okay. Thanks.
Yeah, hello, my name is Rand Boydale, representing Scottish Ecological Design Association. Loretta talked about data, and Benjamin talked about modeling data. One thing I've come across recently is the weather data used for our building energy simulation models is out of date and wasn't particularly accurate anyway, and doesn't reflect the rising temperature. and Benjamin talked about, the flood height levels not being accurate. Surely that is the sort of thing that if we're wanting to mitigate risk and avoid risk, we need to make sure that sort of modelling data is actually as accurate as we can make it now. What process do we need for those different organisations to update those things?
Great, thank you very much. Ben, would you like to dive in?
Sure, I mean, I'll say broadly, you're absolutely right. The quality of data is critical. And there are so many different data sets out there, right, that there's a lot of work to do. And I know a lot of organizations are working on it. It's an evolving process. I think, and the climate hazard, as the speakers have alluded to, I really think is the easy part of this. Because if you go to the systemic risk discussion we've been having, right? In climate science, we like to say there are forcers. We're forcing the climate. But the forcing is very simple. We're adding a few parts per million carbon dioxide. Each year, it's very linear. And that produces very complex, discontinuous, nonlinear behavior in the climate system. But that, in turn, is the much more unruly forcer for the socio-economic system and the political system and its set of interlocking and cascading risks. So it is an enormous communications challenge, and you're right, we have to do the best we can to get the data at the foundation as strong as we can, but that is still a widespread challenge.
Thank you. In the interest of trying to get as many questions in as possible and just my queue in my head, I think there was someone at the back here. Yeah, we'll go to you, then we'll come to you, sir, just in terms of the queue, and then we'll come to the gentleman with the mask at the front. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Magnus Benzi from the Stockholm Environment Institute and Adaptation Without Borders. Thanks to all the speakers. I think it's a fascinating topic, and you've all addressed really good parts of it. My question is about, given the complexity of systemic risk, and given what you said, Loretta, about DRR and adaptation already being governed by separate institutes within the institutions, do any of the panelists have examples of where systemic risk has been well governed by a national government or any other actor? As we try and address this new challenge, are there any anecdotes or insights of where we see systemic risk being well governed? Thank you.
Big and very important question. Loretta, and then I'm looking at Tim, maybe, and Regina, so we might take a few answers on this. So Loretta, do you want to go first?
Well, I think it's a fantastic question, but it's a difficult question because systemic risk is evolving constantly, so we can't say it's being well managed. But what I actually see is that there are countries that are really making steps towards integrated approaches. And just give you the examples of the Philippines, which now has a cabinet cluster on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and disaster risk reduction. So really trying to bridge these gaps. And I was on a panel 2 days ago. Colombia is also working in this same way, Malawi. So countries are kind of intuitively coming to the conclusion that they cannot manage this separately. Some of these countries are impeded by legislative processes which have set up these things quite divided. But maybe the one example that I have seen is around COVID, where you have seen so many governments put in place multi-sectoral management processes that really too late, by the way. I mean, it was after the pandemic was in place, but nonetheless, that really was causing multi-sector, bringing together interministerial commissions and other things to manage it, because COVID was a systemic cascading event. So managing it in one single silo wasn't going to work. So our hope is that we will learn the lessons from COVID and maintain these types of multi-sectoral, intergovernmental, but also multi-stakeholder governance mechanisms. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got just around under 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to take a brief answer from Tim and Regina if you want to come in, and then we'll come to you, sir.
So I think in answer to Magnus's question, I would have said COVID as well, but I would have said that COVID shows how far we've got to go. You know, yesterday, Magnus and I were at an event where there was talk about what are the lessons learned from COVID? How can we kind of improve our resilience and make things better? And there was a talk about a kind of 10-year research program to learn the lessons. And the obvious thing that Europe, for example, should give a whole load of vaccines to sub-Saharan Africa to reduce our risk wasn't part of that agenda because we haven't even learned that significant lesson today. So I think, you know, every country had some sort of pandemic preparedness. Didn't work very well. I think the danger is that every time we have a crisis, that goes in the black swan. It's not going to happen again for another 100 years. Let's forget about it, rather than actually the real lessons that we need to learn to really deeply embed resilience into our economies. So I'm a bit more pessimistic.
Glass half full, glass half empty. Please, sir, if you'd like to ask a question.
Thanks very much. It's Max from the University of British Columbia. I was just wondering to what extent the risk analysis tends to freeze political and economic systems, and whether there's a strong argument to maybe to incorporate them within the modelling itself, specifically subsidies to fossil fuel companies, and whether they could be considered risks as well. Is that?
Okay, fantastic. I'm just going to look along my speakers. Also, Jana, maybe in terms of responses, would you like to take that one? You talked in your presentation about responses and what risks that embodies as well. Do you want to take this one on? Do fossil fuel subsidies embody a risk that need to be conveyed to decision makers alongside systemic and direct risks?
Yes, thank you. Exactly. This is the type of question that we need to ask and to see how, I mean, on my last slide, you have seen that we need to take different agendas that we have on the horizon, or that we are engaged in right now, the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate action, Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We cannot work in silos anymore. We have to, when we try to answer such questions, we have to see how we can address this in the context of all goals that we have to make us a safer planet. And if we're talking about responses, one response that could be useful or helpful, if we only see it in the silo, it could, for instance, these subsidies may help the economy in the short set, but on the other hand, basically undermining other goals we have. This, we have to go away from that. We need to see those goals, and as Loretta said, we also need to have the values behind it that are so nicely imprinted in the Sustainable Development Goals. So these values, no hunger, no poverty, clean air, and these kind of things, we need to have those in the back of the mind when policy decisions are made. And as I said, the complexity requires that we see the Paris Agreement, climate action, Sustainable Development Goal, disaster risk reduction in conjunction.
Thank you, Jana. I'm just going to look across. I don't think anyone else wants to chip in at this moment, so we'll go to you, please, sir.
Right, thank you. Jonathan Ratcliffe from the University of Birmingham. And there's a great question just before, and my point was thinking about how do we move away from the increasing efficiency of systems, or optimizing everything so that we have just-in-time systems, or we have the minimum number of people working in local governance institutions just to deliver the services, when we see from COVID and the fuel crises how we need some extra capacity that's ready to provide that resilience. But how do we value that going forward? Because a lot of these savings have been driven by more central government, when a lot of the response has to come from a local level. Thanks.
Great. We'll go to Tim. I think it's also just worth bearing in mind, we had a question earlier on about food waste resilience within the agricultural sector. I think there's sort of some similarities there.
Yeah, well, I think the predominant paradigm that we've lived under for the last 30 or 40 years is that economic growth is the most important arbiter of national well-being. And economic growth means gaining efficiency. Gaining efficiency in a world that's relatively stable is about making things just in time, reducing the redundancy, centralizing, reducing flexibility to do everything that makes it as smooth and as efficient as possible. But all of those things around efficiency strip out the resilience that we increasingly need. So the challenge is, how do we build back that resilience within our kind of current economic paradigm, that's too costly because we've stripped it out. And it comes down to, is economic growth, and it touches on the last question, is economic growth the best measure of what is ultimately to do with human well-being? Is that the best measure that we should use, or should we refine that and say economic growth is important, but actually the well-being of our populations is much more important as well, and try and work out where the wealth accumulation and the economic growth comes in, and where the actually costing our systems properly, internalizing externalities, building resilience, putting back redundancy in, putting back diversity into supply chains, et cetera, those all cost. And at the moment, the political pressure is that we can't afford to pay those costs. But eventually, as these disasters and the extreme weather hits us more and more, we'll realize that we have no choice but to build back into a more resilient system.
Thanks, Tim. Regina, did you want to say something on this?
It's general, several things. One is adaptation versus policies that someone asked previously. I think a lot of the policies is for adaptation and mitigation that are co-benefits. So we could look into policies that actually do both, like say mangroves. If you plant them, they capture CO2, so it's mitigation, but they actually protect the coast from storm surge. We started to looking at simple questions. It's complex, yes, it's complex, but what we wanted to do is try to find simple solutions. I think one of the problems also, regards the question which countries are doing okay on this, is that a paper recent published says that there is a lack of a measurement of actually success of adaptation policies. So we don't even know which policies actually that has been done that are successful. So to then actually, this is much more basic and perhaps even simpler, and we don't know, you see. And to bridge this complexity between the uncertainty and the stakeholder, what we are proposing, do the science in a more simpler way, then it will make much easier to bridge this. This is the point that I want to make. So, yes, that's.
Thank you very much. We've got just about exactly 3 minutes left. We'll come to you at the front, and then I'm afraid we're probably going to run out of time for questions, so I'm sorry. But please do ask a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation so far. It's been fantastic. My name's Eden. I'm here with the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation. And I'm from Canada, and time and again, I've been very frustrated seeing how policymakers and politicians are more concerned with electability in the next electoral cycle, and that's, I think, a trend across democracies. So how do we work with politicians and policymakers beyond electoral timeframes and cycles? And related to that, how do we depoliticize and depolarize the issue of climate change, which has fallen, along this left-right divide? How do we make sure that all parties are pushing for climate solutions and not just parties on one side of the aisle?
Looking along, does anyone want to take this one? Ben, and a concise answer if possible.
Yeah, well, it's hard. That's a big problem. And I think that's a big part of the communications challenge that we're all working on. I have no silver bullet there. Our hope is we can appeal a little to legacy, and this is becoming much more salient. So.
Brilliant. Tim.
So just very briefly, I think my answer to that is not to depoliticize the issue, but to politicize the issue, because I think if we as citizens really raise the ante about this is what we're concerned about, then it makes it an electable proposition. At the moment, what we have is we have people in the bubble who are very concerned, and then a whole lot of the citizenry who are concerned about lifestyle changes, and they don't want that. What we need to do is spread, champion the issues, understand the risks, actually say a transformed economy would be a much better place for our health and well-being, even if not necessarily economically in the way that some people imagine.
Thanks, Tim. I've got about 53 seconds to try and summarize a very, very, very diverse conversation. I will attempt this. I think we've talked about making it local, making it relatable, not overly quantifying the importance of systemic risks, the difficulty in conveying those systemic risks, the importance of being bottom-up and top-down at the same time, the importance of including responses as a risk within itself, the importance of breaking down silos of policymakers, disciplines and departments. And I think we've then come back around to the COVID and lessons of COVID. Where is good governance? We can probably look to COVID for some examples of good governance. And then a fascinating end of the conversation, GDP, is it a good measure? And the need to politicize all these systemic and direct risks and force decision makers to take action. And upon that, I think I have to end it. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed all of your participation, really engaged audience. Thank you to all the panelists. Please do ask us questions afterwards. I'm afraid that can't be done on the virtual platform. We do have some reports at the back of the room, so please do take them away, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you all very much for your time.